Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you may be watching this. Welcome to another Joko conversation. I am Brother Youssef, a member of the Joko, flying solo again and again pre-recording. What has turned out to be a little series on my use of the Handmaid's Tale in the classroom. Really, my former use of the Handmaid's Tale in the classroom, as I explained in the first, in what has become this series, Unexpected. As always, and as my partner and the founder of the Joko, Tasha, always does when she's with me, we acknowledge that we do this work in the tradition, in honor of, and picking up the baton from our own ancestors, our own personal ancestors here, those Africans, descended from those Africans, transported in that human trafficking called the Middle Passage, ending up in Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and eventually California. And we honor those ancestors who instill in us, right, the spirit to continue to struggle for liberation, for human liberation and justice in the world. And we always acknowledge that we in the Joko know we do this work on the unceded lands of the Tongva people of what is now called the Los Angeles Basin. And I am picking up with something I said in the last video on my uses of the Handmaid's Tale in the classroom in my first year composition class. And that's resistance, right? I in the last video on the novel, I made almost a throwaway comment, though I wasn't really just throwing it away. But the idea that maybe I would do one more video talking about forms of resistance in the novel. And so I'm following through on that. And indeed, Tasha, right, gave me that feedback also that, yeah, it would be a good idea to, do one more, right, and to pick up with resistance, because the resistance matters, and the project of the novel is a political project. Literature is political. Now, indeed, I'm of the opinion that all art, has a political function. Even if the artist doesn't have any kind of particular political project in mind, art and the creation of art, it exists in society. It exists in its historical moment. It exists under the conditions of its production. And its production within, in this contemporary context, in the modern context of print capitalism, it exists in a political economy driven by profit. And the novel is making a political intervention. As I explained in the previous two videos on The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood, she's raising a question, and it is a political question. Again, right? What if a far right, white nationalist, white Christian nationalist, ultra fundamentalist organization, group, paramilitary, shadow government, engineered a coup in the United States? What would that look like? As she at the time was responding to the growing influence and intervention of the moral majority, the Christian fundamentalist right at that particular time, and the way in which it was um, aggressively intervening into policy, and particularly social policy. But this video is not about the history of the moral majority, and the kinds of organizations, religious organizations behind it that were fundamental to it, the Falwells, the Robertsons, etc. But I just want to be clear that it is that political context that the novel is addressing when Margaret Atwood is writing it in the early and mid 1980s, and when it's published in the mid 1980s. And here we are, right? So the various forms of resistance in this now near and recognizable future that she imagines, in which this ultra right white Christian nationalist group have again engineered a coup. And the United States, as we ordinarily understand it, no longer exist. This new Republic of Gilead has been founded, and exactly what the borders are of this Republic of Gilead are uncertain in the novel. Because again, as I mentioned in the last video, our narrator is limited. She only knows so much. She knows enough through her direct experience, her observations, her interactions, to share a lot with us. But there's still plenty she doesn't know. We do know, for example, though, that the Canadian border, the US-Canadian border, or what was the US-Canadian border, is still intact. How much of the current continental United States becomes part of the Republic of Gilead is unclear. And we also know that there is an armed resistance out there, but it's the subtle forms of resistance that are very much at the heart of the novel, because our narrator has no opportunity, no way to participate in that broader armed struggle, but needs to find ways to resist within the context of the commander's household. And she does. And it's established again in that very rich, very short opening chapter, all of 2 pages, as the narrator explains to us that the cots of the women, right, that have been set up in the gymnasium for them are far enough apart that they can't speak to each other, right? As the regime uses space to try to control connection. But what the women do is learn how to lip read. And through learning how to lip read, learn each other's names. And so, whatever names they are given, once they are assigned to a commander's household, they know their own names and they know that others know their name. So, already, a very subtle but profound form of resistance to the totalitarian oppression of the society, is established, exercised, and it's those little kinds of of acts of resistance that give the narrator hope. And again, that hope is so critical for her to hold on to make it bearable, to be able to survive. Other forms of these this kind of resistance. Um, they are, that is the handmaids do have their entire lives circumscribed, and so um, really have to steal time, steal moments where they can interact authentically with each other in this profoundly surveillant state, such that the secret police of the society are called the eyes, EYES, the eyes, right? To, you know, can we make it plain, right? The level of surveillance going on, and of course, the regime. There's always a biblical tie-in, right, to the names they choose, and so you can think in terms of, his eye is upon us, or this sort of thing. His eye is on the sparrow, always watching. But it's a surveillance culture, and a religious police, and as such, the handmaids and others in the society, they're really expected to police themselves, right? The Like good slaves are to police themselves, which makes some forms of resistance more dangerous than others, because the issue of who can you trust is always there, right? There's another kind of resistance. The message that is left for our narrator by the previous handmaid, the Latin phrase. What is it? Nolite te bastardes carburandorum. Don't let the bastards get you down. Nolite te bastardes carburandorum. She finds this etched into the wall, into the wooden like floorboard, or I'm not sure what you call that piece, right at the bottom of the wall, in her closet, a message from the previous handmaid that was left for her. How, uh, how the condition of the previous handmaid is left open to speculation. We learn early on, though, that there's nothing in her room or her bathroom that is sharp, that can be broken, no glass that can be broken, that no shards that can be created. There's nothing in her room. Well, there's the imprint of where a chandelier used to be. The implication being that that most desperate form of resistance, suicide. And we know there are historical precedents for it, rather than succumb to enslavement or capture. Individuals choosing to take their own life. The possibility of that very drastic form of resistance in that extreme situation has been taken away. Now, we don't know if it was taken away before the previous handmaid or after the previous handmaid, depending on what other form of resistance she chose. But she leaves this message for our narrator: Nolite te bastardes carborundorum. Probably certain that whoever followed her, the new handmaid, who happens to be our narrator, who, if she doesn't read Latin, will eventually learn what it is, because of the commander's surreptitious meetings with the handmaids in his study to play Scrabble, talk, read, share his old Latin, his old high school Latin books, specifically highlighting the story of the Sabine women and the peopling of Rome, a story, a mythology that is also called the rape of the Sabine women. So that too is a form of resistance, right? Leaving that little message for the next handmaid. And it is a struggle that our narrator is kind of constantly dealing with. How should she feel about the commander, who again is essentially her owner, her master? But she has an ambivalence. She's sort of clear. She's clear on the relationship, right? And the character of the relationship, of the social relation. And recognizes, or at least, voices that she should hate him. But she can't bring herself to hate him. She only doesn't love him. She doesn't necessarily like him, but he is tolerable. And through their secret meetings in his study, she grows to understand him more. But she does imagine what she could do to him and how she could do it if she wanted to step up her level of resistance. There's an underground, right? So again, all the various ways that the characters find to resist in this totalitarian society. And really, let me not get off of Offred in the household. Another form of resistance for her um, is the stealing of little things around the household, but and particularly things that are going to be useful to her, like butter. She takes the butter off of her meal trays, hides it in her shoe so that she can use the butter as a form of lotion. Because again, the handmaids aren't allowed toiletries. There's this whole culture of against notions of vanity, and so even that's a bit of resistance. And for us, on the night of the ceremony, and the ceremony is the impregnation ceremony, that involves three people: the handmaid lying back on the bed with her legs open and up in the lap, lying with her torso in the lap of the wife, while the commander approaches to do the business. And again, pleasure is not the object, kink is not the object. Everybody's doing their duty, and they do it like soldiers. Although there is more to it than that. The scene is it's an exercise in disembodiment, as our characters describing everything in the room, in a way to not be present with what's going on, though she can't help being present there, including speculation or rumination about her agency in this moment, in this situation. But leading up to that, again, is the ceremony in Serena Joy's sitting room, where the beginning of the ceremony, where the family gathers. That is, the wife and the servants of the household gather, including Nick, the chauffeur, handyman, live above the garage servant, probably also of a military rank. The who at the beginning of the ceremony, as everyone takes their place, and the handmaid takes her place kneeling next to the seated wife. Nick barely touches her foot with his foot, her shoe with his shoe. And whatever is going on there is a bit of a foreshadow in the novel, but is too also a form of resistance because it's a transgression. So again, just like Offred, our narrator, stealing little things like the butter, a way of taking control, resisting control, resisting the rules and the values of the state. They're not to have any contact, right? Because again, the regime controls or attempts to control human interactions across the various roles or ranks in the society. That evening after the ceremony, when our narrator is back in her room and she has an urge again to take control of something. And so she decides that she's going to go back to the sitting room and steal one of Serena Joy's flowers. But it's an act of resistance, and it's an act of taking control. It's necessary to take control, to keep hope, just like it becomes necessary to not give in to despair, right? To resist despair as much as resisting the state. Well, the state, particularly as it is embodied by the commander and the wife. And so she sneaks back to the study that evening. And while in the study, she's approached by Nick. Neither of them is supposed to be there. And they have a passionate moment, and it is just a moment. And they feel like they could go so far. But it is just a moment. And it is an incredible risk that they're taking. And this drive to transgress and the hungriness of their bodies. But he's actually there to deliver a message from the commander about seeing her and eventually setting up these secret meetings in his study for companionship. And indeed, though she's curious about what's going on and figured it was only a matter of time, what he's interested in initially is playing Scrabble, right? And having conversations, and again, eventually providing different kinds of contraband for her as reward. Things like real lotion, old magazines, because again, the handmaids aren't supposed to be reading anything. And for her, again, another type of resistance, a chance for her to learn things, right? To gather information from him. She wants to know. She wants to know what he knows. She wants to know what he wants. And she also wants to know what he knows. Because that knowledge, gaining that knowledge, is a form of resistance and power. Again, in a situation where she has very little power, here's something. What can she do with it, right? So that's another form of resistance. The partner that she walks with of Glenn, at a particular point in the novel, or fairly early in the novel, says to her, "Isn't it a lovely May Day?" That turns out to be a test, as she was looking to see if our narrator was familiar with the password Mayday, which is the signal that you're a member of the underground. Eventually, of Glenn takes the chance to be less subtle and say something that the handmaids don't ordinarily say to each other, something off script. Taking the risk because she doesn't know if Offred will be the sort of handmaid who will rat her out, but she isn't. And so she is able to learn about the underground, about Mayday, and how she, as a handmaid, along with other handmaids, can how should I support the resistance. But the fact is, there's an underground, and the underground is extensive enough that there's an early scene in the novel that the guards at a checkpoint, when Glenn and Fred are on their shopping walk, there is a Martha who is nervous at a checkpoint, fumbling, looking for her ID, and the guards shoot her. Turns out she was innocent. There was no bomb in her bag, but it also indicates that there's all kinds of resistance going on that has the guards trigger happy. Repression produces resistance. Offred, through of Glenn, becomes part of that resistance, whatever little they can do. There's a particular event that goes on in the novel. In this really interesting section of the novel, as there's an effort to try to understand, what has happened environmentally in the society. Why is it that women aren't and men aren't reproducing? Why have so many men gone sterile? Why have so many women become barren? What are some of the environmental hazards? No specific answer is ever given, but several of the ills associated with modern industrial life are pointed out. The levels of pollution that had poisoned the planet, various kinds of viruses that had gotten out of control. There's reference to a syphilis that had become more or less untreatable. The big one had finally hit California and set off some of the nuclear power plants that are built on or near the San Andreas Fault. In general, the kind of laissez-faire, unregulated, capitalist excess had so damaged the environment and the bodies of people that this is likely a major reason for this rise in infertility in men and women. Nothing definitive ever said, but these ills are recounted as Offred and others speculate about what has brought them to this point. So when there is a birth, and you can't even always be sure that it will be a healthy birth, but when there is a birth, it's a big deal. So there's an event called the birthday, which ends up being this kind of meticulous ritual associated with birth, very much like the ceremony. It's a kind of sympathetic magic, so that when the handmaid is actually ready to deliver, the wife positions herself behind the handmaid so that the baby is energetically the wife's, and not the handmaid's child, as it were. So what happens at these events, though, is that they're little looser, right? A little less monitored. So there's an opportunity to find things out, right? As the The wives celebrate, they have their little wine. They really don't interact with the handmaids. The handmaids are able to, have a little relief among themselves. So because it's a little looser, it's a safer place for communication. It's a place to find information, to get information. And again, um, information becomes a version of resistance, and it helps in the ability to resist the regime. At the birthday ceremony, Offred finds out that her best friend had been her best friend in college, and they had remained friends, and they were in the Red Center together. Moira had escaped. Moira had escaped the Red Center. She had escaped the Red Center in a similar to the way in which Offred imagines she could assassinate the commander by taking apart the plumbing in the toilet to take one of the long rods out that she could use to stab the commander when he least expected it, while he might be trying to make a move during one of these sessions in the study. Moira actually does something like that. She doesn't stab the aunt in the Red Center, but she's able to use the piece, with it pointed in her back, to tie her up, change her clothes, disguise herself as an aunt, and escape. So Moira is out there like a runaway slave. She's a loose woman. And you have to appreciate the double meaning there, right? In this society that is so obsessed with women's purity and controlling women's sexuality. And we know this term, right, in our own culture, the idea of the loose woman, the woman who controls her own sexuality. And Moira is a woman who controls her own sexuality. Moira is also a lesbian, a loose woman who's now on the loose. Our narrator loves this, and it is a source of hope for her. Moira's resistance. Moira, who's like a runaway slave. And indeed, we learn, again, these forms of resistance, we learn at the beginning of the ceremony when they're watching the news, and through other reports later in the novel, that just as there had been an underground railroad during the history of enslavement in the United States, there's now what they're calling in the time frame of the novel the female underground railroad, to try to help women escape to Canada. And indeed, our narrator and her family, before they were caught, we learn in flashbacks, they were trying to escape to Canada. Her husband Luke, their daughter. They didn't make it. And she wonders at what happened to Luke. Is he alive? Is he in prison somewhere? Is he dead? Did he escape? Did they imprison him? Did they kill him? And she has to believe all three at the same time. And that too is a form of resistance, a form of her keeping her resolve. And indeed, that double-edged sword of memory, right? It is a form of resistance to remember how things were before. But those memories also nag at her and sometimes weaken her resolve, right? But nonetheless, right, this notion of Moira out on her own, it's really important to her. right? As again, as a form of resistance. The so I'm realizing now that I've already been talking for 40 minutes, and I mean it can just go so fast, right? The the fact that she's telling the story. Okay, so um, let me slow down because I've already been given spoilers to you, and there are things I'm not sharing, right? I mean, there's a level of, if you haven't read the novel, you really should read the novel, right? It's really interesting, right? It's very relatable, and again, the way in which it's told, right? It's accessible in that way, right? The So she grows more and more desperate, right? As she continues to resist, to take part in the underground as well as she can. But as we get deeper into the novel, right, it gets harder and harder to do that. There's the story of her mother, who was a radical feminist, and now I'm calling her a radical feminist, right? And I don't know if she was a radical in the way that the radical feminists who are socialist, Marxist, Leninist feminists are radical feminists, but I think in that idea of notions of the matriarchal, um, or just this radical decentering, right, of men, of the male, but also her mother decides that she wants to become a mother, that many of her feminist comrades oppose, right? But it's something, again, her mother exercising her agency as a woman to make her own choices, um, without this notion of needing a husband or a partner to raise the child, right? And apparently didn't. Um, so But she does learn. She learns that her mother, who had been a prominent feminist, who's who shows up in the various films from like news footage of feminist demonstrations by women, events like Take Back the Night, but who are now reclassified as unwomen. She learns from Moira, who has been captured, Moira, who has had to compromise, Moira, who is now doing sex work at a place called Jezebel's, where the commander brings Offred, because now he wants more than just to play Scrabble. Because as he says, you can't cheat nature, meaning you can't keep these powerful men from wanting to have fun outside of their marriage, right? Is the excuse he's making. But she learns that Moira was captured. Moira tells her the story, and the fact that Moira, from whom she had taken so much strength, right? Just the idea of Moira's resistance, and from her mother, right? Her memory of her mother, from whom she had taken such strength, right? The strength to hold on, to keep trying to resist. If the system, if the system could defeat them, and she thinks of them as stronger than herself, how can she fight? And so she becomes more and more desperate. How should I say? More and more reckless, because you see, as it turns out, Serena Joy, the wife in the household, is also convinced that the commander is sterile. So no matter how often they do the ceremony, Offred is never going to get pregnant. Eventually, she'll be shipped to another commander's home. So Serena Joy offers her a deal. You can hang out with, you could hang out with Nick. Let Nick do it. This happens in many of the households. Again, it speaks to the corruption, the double standards, the hypocrisy, right, of the Gileadian society. But it turns out that Nick, we learn, is part of the underground. And indeed, the entire story has been a form of resistance, right? As I, have revealed already, the conceit of the novel, which you learn in the final chapter, Historical Notes on the Handmaid's Tale. We have been at a conference like 200 years in the future up in Nunavut, Denai, Nunavut, Inuit country. There is no more United States or Canada. We have been listening to tapes that had been recorded by our narrator and that were found in like a footlocker in the Maine area, or what used to be Maine, sometime later. The scholars don't know what happened to her. Was she able to escape to England? Was she recaptured? No one knows. But these tapes were left behind. She left a record. The novel itself, these tapes, are the biggest form of resistance in the novel. Telling the story, not letting. I was supposed to put this on the screen a long time ago, but I guess you guys already know what I'm talking about, right? So anyway, the novel itself, right, telling the story, is the greatest form of resistance in the novel, right? This idea that the regime would not be able to do this and destroy all records of its inhumanity, of its cruelty, but this project of handmaids and perhaps others telling their stories for posterity, so that in this department of Caucasian anthropology at the University of Nunavut, we, the audience members, could hear the story. The novel itself is the chief form of resistance that the novel expresses. Tell the story. So it's been like an hour, nearly an hour. I mean, of course, there's so much more, I could say. But like I said, I think you should read the novel. If you haven't read the novel, and even if you have watched the Hulu series, there are differences I've talked about. Again, I think the racial aspects, the racial politics of the novel, right? The obsession with the concern with white birth rates, with eliminating the quote unquote children of Ham, relocating them, bombing Detroit, the blackest city in America, which I always thought was New Orleans, but they were neck and neck. This was an important aspect, and just in the way that the novel was actually very predictive about the rise of Christian nationalism, which again is ensconced in power right now in the United States in this Trump regime. The return of Jim Crow is also accurate. I mean, enough said, right? You know, the anti-blackness of this moment is undeniable. From the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, the redrawing of these lines to nullify the black vote in the traditional Confederacy, the attacks on DEI, the attacks on so-called wokeism, which is something completely made up, right? But to be the target, a way of focusing, right, that anti-blackness, even to the point of with all their chest, right, the open white racism, and the reemergence of racial slurs in public settings. Uh, this is why it's so important, I thought, in the novel, and why for so many years I thought it was important to teach, because again, as I started, literature is political. And I certainly, when I'm making choices about what I'm going to ask my students to read, and both nonfiction prose, and any literary works, I am thinking about the values in those texts, the political values in those texts, how they unmask empire, how they unmask capital. Um, I'm quite intentional about that. And I think to pretend that we aren't wanting to engage, various kinds of political and social values in the text, through the text we choose, that's just disingenuous. And certainly in a conservative instructor's class, or a maybe what we might call a traditionalist, folks who think it's so important to assign, canonical books, right? The so-called great books of Western civilization. Um, this this notion of of or well, actually, I'm just repeating myself. The the elevation of of Westernness, or of again, the Western tradition. Those are political choices that those instructors, those scholars are making. So why are we pretending that our choices in the classroom aren't political choices? I'm quite open about that, and I do uh, pick material that I think will raise the kind of political questions that I think are important. Questions around um, humanism, um, the alienating impact of capitalist relations, um, issues of imperialism, etc. Right? Which doesn't mean everybody in the class has to think like me. Not at all. I don't, can we address these questions? Where else are you getting this type of reading? Where else are you being asked to think about the kinds of things I'm asking my students to think about? Reading books like Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, Toni Morrison's Paradise, Bertolt Brecht's Galileo, Amiri Baraka's Dutchman, etc. Right? Chinua Achebe's Man of the People, Patrick Chamoiseau's School Days, etc. Right? There are various kinds of literary texts, I've taught. the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party, the Declaration of Independence, the 4th of July oration, etc. The choices we make, the readings we ask our students to engage, to try to understand, to unpack, to argue, etc. They are informed by our politics, by our values. This is why I picked Margaret Atwood's novel when I did teach it, because I think it is making an important political point in a very subtle kind of way. When it first came out, right? Folks didn't necessarily think it was believable or possible in a particular kind of way, although others certainly did. And so we get to engage that, right? Anyway, coming up on an hour. Appreciate you watching this. Little bug flying around. Appreciate you watching this. Thank you. If you have any comments, please, by all means, comment. Do all the things that we need you to do. We really appreciate if you would subscribe if you have not subscribed already. Please do like the video, right? Do help us with the algorithm. I mean, that's just the way this thing works, right? The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get. Please share. And apparently, yeah, the comments, right? The more you comment, that bumps up our video, gives us some props in the algorithm. So help us out with the tyranny of the algorithm, please. Subscribe, like, share. And by all means, comment. Really appreciate you. Hopefully we'll be back Thursday with something else. Tasha will be rejoining me soon, I know. And I will close the way I always close, quoting Bob Marley from the Natty Dread album, the song Revolution. Revelation reveals the truth. It takes a revolution to make a solution. So let's make a revolution, y'all, and we'll see you next time.